It's great for me to be back here in Helena, especially on such a beautiful day. 20 years ago, I took a contract that had me here for 2 or 3 weeks every month for a couple of years. And I was eating breakfast regularly at the No Sweat and playing basketball at the 7th Avenue Gym and drinking beer at Miller's Crossing. And finding my way from the Holiday Inn to this building before Google Navigate. It was really useful for me coming back. And it's great to be back and see that at least some of those institutions are still here. I spent last night in Missoula and drove over today up the Blackfoot and through the Avon Valley, which was the same route I had taken 27 years ago on my first visit to Montana about this time of year. And of course, it's just absolutely a gorgeous drive. And 27 years ago, on that drive was the first time that I was thinking about, boy, wouldn't it be great to live here? And so today I got to celebrate that again and really appreciate how lucky we all are to live in this wonderful place. But I think 100 years ago, what people expected our lives would be like was very different than what our lives are actually like. And so that's what I want to talk about a little bit tonight. I want to make sure that, that we're not just talking about a single ghost town. I want to try and broaden this as much as possible. So I'm going to pose some questions at the beginning here. These questions don't have answers. There is no quiz at the end. It's just a way to think about broader issues other than a specific story. And so one question is, should the economy here in Montana be different than it is somewhere else? How do we mix urban life and nature? How important is the layout of a city to that city's success? Is the layout going to determine success, or are there other factors that are more important? And then the notion that rain follows the plow was something that was very popular 100, 150 years ago. The notion that that if we could farm these dry areas, eventually they would become productive because the world wanted to work that way. That proved to be sort of difficult, as we will see. But what are the similar ideas that we have today that may be leading us astray, that may be leading to ghost towns of the future? So those are just some questions to think about. Let me start by asking how many of you have gotten off Interstate 90 in East Laurel? There's the main, oh, all right, we've got maybe a third to half have gotten off in East Laurel. Not the main Laurel exit, but the one just 3 miles closer to Billings. I always expect that maybe not everyone is raising their hand, that maybe actually more than a third of you, maybe a half to 2/3 of you have been there, and you're afraid that I'm going to point out the only thing at the East Laurel exit is Shotgun Willie's, what we in the area know as the East Laurel Ballet Company. I'm not talking about Shotgun Willie's tonight. What I'm talking about is on the other side of the interstate. Well, actually, there's not much there. There are 3 or 4 mailboxes for Mossmain Lane, but there's no real city there.
Which side is it?
So this is the north side of Interstate 90.
Between the interstate and the frontage road?
This is actually the frontage road, and right here is where it has turned north.
Goes across the track.
Goes across the tracks right there as it turns north, and you can go to Yellowstone Boys and Girls Club or Ranch from there. So that's the location for those of you who have gotten off the exit there. And this is what it was supposed to look like. Main railroad paralleling I-90. And so that picture was taken, perhaps at Central Station or the Social Center. And Shotgun Willie's would have been maybe the municipal market. we'll get back to this layout in a minute, but let me tell you a bit about the history of Mossmain. Mossmain started with Preston B. Moss, who is most famous for building the Moss Mansion. Whoops. I'm trying to find which one's the laser. There it is. Moss Mansion in Billings. And then these are 3 photos of him at various points in his life. Preston B. Moss was really quite an accomplished figure in Billings. He arrived about 1893, I think, and quickly made $400,000 in the sheep business, which was quite a bit of money back then. Emerged from the Panic of 1893, the biggest recession to date at that point, with more money than a lot of people who had lost money. So he was suddenly a major figure in the area. He was the co-founder, co-developer of the Northern Hotel, also the Great Western Sugar Company, and he invested in irrigation, in electricity, heat, telephone, all the sort of basic utilities required for a growing city such as Billings. He was involved in providing those. He also co-owned an early newspaper that later became part of the Billings Gazette. So he was really a major figure in Billings. And he thought of himself as a progressive at the time when progressive meant people who believed in providing this sort of infrastructure that we take for granted today. Central heating, telephone systems, even airports. He was a big proponent of the Billings Airport when it was built. So not the progressive ideas that we have today, but those that we sort of take for granted today. With all of his endeavors and his risk-taking, Moss spent almost his entire life in considerable debt. And he was not always successful. Not all of his ventures were successful. His main interest was in a bank that failed about 1910, and he referred to it as sort of a cooked-up deal, as if his competitors were collaborating with the regulators to do him in somehow. He had finally gotten out of debt in about 1940, and the Northern Hotel burned down. And he was, at this point, a rather aged man, and people asked him, "What are you going to do?" And he said, "Well, of course, we're going to borrow some money and rebuild it." Interesting, fun guy for the history of Billings. But about, well, let me back up a minute. After he'd been in Billings for about 20 years, he seemed to get anxious and uptight, and he decided that actually as much building as he'd done for Billings, he wanted to do even more. And he wanted to do it 15 miles west of there. And so he came up with the idea for Mossmain. Now, why did he choose that spot 15 miles west? Here's Billings, and here's Mossmain. This is a map of area railroads in 1917, just a few years after 1910 when he came up with this idea. And of course, the Northern Pacific coming up the Yellowstone Valley had been the main rail line for many, many years at this point. But in after the turn of the century, a couple of other railroads came in. One was the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy heading down to Casper, and from Casper down to Billings. It had 2 routes to get there, one through Sheridan, west of the Pryors, and one that at that time I believe was more popular, running east of the Pryors. And then the Great Northern, having built all the way across the High Line, created spurs down to Great Falls, and from Great Falls down to, not quite to Billings, to Mossmain. There was nothing in Mossmain at the time. It was really close to Laurel, but Laurel wasn't much of a city back then. It was just sort of a hamlet. But nevertheless, the Northern Pacific was building the biggest, the biggest rail yards between Minneapolis and at least Spokane, or maybe even between Minneapolis and Seattle, they were going to build them right there. And so P.B. Moss said, well, maybe we need a city there to support them. After all, Billings had been started because it was on the railroad. Maybe Billings was out of date. Maybe Mossmain could be a new Chicago. I'm almost certain that P.B. Moss was familiar with the history of Chicago, the way it had built up around the railroads, and the way that all of these various railroads to various points in the east centered in Chicago, and then various railroads heading out to various points in the Midwest came out of there. And being a hub was just essential to the growth of Chicago. Those of you who've read the wonderful book Nature's Metropolis by William Cronin, he talks about how, first of all, they were able to get great rates by setting competing routes to New York against each other. And then they were also able to build around transfer facilities. Grain elevators were invented in Buffalo but perfected in Chicago. Because Chicago was the transshipment point, it became the great place for meat packing and lots of other industries that started with shipping but grew from there. And so Chicago had been the great success story of the 19th century, how to build a giant metropolis around a railroad. And yet Chicago was built back when this area was new and being newly settled. And so maybe now that this area was being newly settled, there could be a new Chicago on the frontier with the rail lines coming in from various places. And the other interesting thing that was happening at that time was the opening of the Panama Canal. And so suddenly shipments by sea were going to be a lot shorter. It was going to be a lot easier to get into Galveston. And so maybe there would be a new transcontinental railroad from Galveston up to Denver, already a big metropolis, up to Mossmain, and then out to Seattle, and shipping off to Asia or shipping off either to Europe or South America or even Southern Asia down that way. I'm not quite sure why the opening of this new transcontinental route made him think that this transcontinental route would be popular. But he did definitely believe that that was going to be a force, and so that Mossmain could be a really exciting way to place for growth. By the way, feel free to stop me and ask any questions, make any comments. I don't need this to be super formal. If I'm not making things clear, or if you've got questions, please feel free to speak up. So let me pause here and make sure you're with me so far. Any questions, comments? Great. Yeah.
Did Great Northern come in at Mossmain?
Yes. Yeah, you can see it coming in just west of Billings here. Even today, you can see those tracks coming in from the north.
Were those other tracks going out to Portland? Were they there at the time already?
Yes, I
They would use those.
other tracks. You mean?
Ones that go through Wyoming, western Wyoming.
Oh, right. Right. He had the vision that Mossmain would become like Chicago. There are ways to get to Denver without going through Chicago, but lots of people do. And yeah, I don't want to make too much of this vision, but it really struck me that he mentioned it because it seems so bizarre today. Why would you go through Billings or Mossmain? But it's an example of how the thinking was perhaps different at that time. And of course, all of this was so new. These north-south routes had just been built in the last 5 years. So who knew how they were going to develop? Thanks for asking the questions. Here's a close-up view, and you can see these rail lines still exist today. This is what used to be the Great Northern coming right into Mossmain, and the old CBQ runs very slowly now down. And this is actually taken from a rail map produced by the states today, and it uses the word Mossmain. I'd been living in the area for over 20 years, and I'd never really heard of Mossmain, but rail aficionados know exactly what you're talking about.
All those rail lines going to, of course, the Big Sky team, they're still in use?
As I understand it, that's correct.
Big Sky is coal strip.
Right. I think a lot of this is coal, so coal coming out of coal strip. Yeah. I can get you the website that I pulled this off of, although I just don't remember it off the top of my head. So P.B. Moss decided that his new city, not only would it be a new metropolis, but he also wanted it to be a garden city. And again, this was a new idea at the time. A man named Ebenezer Howard had written a book, Garden Cities of Tomorrow, where he was hoping to get people living more harmoniously with nature. This was a time when a lot of people were interested in city design and land use planning. It was the time of the City Beautiful movement, part of the progressive movement in general as governments and other central authorities thought about how to make people's lives better. And the arts and crafts movement was a related sense of building interesting structures. And so this diagram just shows, this was Howard's diagram, I believe, of three magnets, town, country, or town and country together being a better way to attract people. The Garden City movement started in England. There's a village called Letchworth that was one of the first to use these principles. And these are some shots of Letchworth today, advertising itself as a garden city. You get some notion of the gardens and their use surrounding houses and whatnot here in the wintertime. Plenty of greenery. I think you also have, walkways and that sort of use of garden type stuff. And of course the contrary image, the thing they were fighting against, were the tenements that were so popular around the turn of the century. There were so many people who were living in such difficult poverty in large cities. And there was a lot of labor unrest, a lot of sort of class struggle during this time. And people wondered if maybe part of the problem was the difficult living conditions that they faced. And so maybe those problems could be alleviated by building more garden cities. And so to implement this idea on the ground, this notion of the garden city, P.B. Moss turned to a man named Walter Burley Griffin, an architect who could design that city. Griffin was an associate of Frank Lloyd Wright in Chicago. He had actually run Wright's firm for a while, had designed some successful houses, but soon turned to city planning as part of his architectural effort. And he entered a competition, perhaps the greatest international competition in the history of the world for city planning and architecture, said one of his clients, to design the new capital of Australia, Canberra. They were building a brand new city in the middle of nowhere to be their capital, and they wanted to design, and Griffin entered, and he won. And so he won this global competition. This is sort of an image of what Canberra looked like, with lots of pods, lots of parks, around a lake which would soon be called Lake Burley Griffin after the man who had helped design it. But his notion of creating all of these parks and pods was very attractive to the Australians, and the Australians gave him the award, and suddenly he was world famous. And on his way back from Australia receiving the award, I think he took a boat into Seattle or Portland, hopped on the train, and came to Montana to look at Mossmain with P.B. Moss. He thought of the two projects as roughly equivalent. He was building the new capital of Australia, and he was building this railroad center of an orchard region in Montana. I always thought it was funny, orchard region. You don't really think of Billings as an orchard region, but I used to do some work in Fromberg, little town just 20 miles south of Billings, and there's a lot of old apple trees in Fromberg. They really were interested in orchards and fruit back 100 years ago, and some of those trees are still going. So Walter Burley Griffin, Canberra, and then he designed Mossmain. I've got 4 different images of Mossmain, not all of them outstanding, but you at least get a sense here of that same sort of central structure with areas emanating out. Again, the emphasis on Garden City, Mossmain, the Yellowstone Garden City. Here's that image we saw earlier. And so these things emanating out is what we saw in the previous photo. But it's all really based around the central area here. And so you have sort of a promenade, almost like like the one in Washington, D.C. in front of the Smithsonian. But it's centered around the City Hall, a civic center, a municipal sort of farmer's market, and then one of the major businesses, which he expected to be a publishing house. And you had a pool, and then on the other side of the tracks, you had the station and some of the social activities. Here's some of the tracks going off, as well as the main Northern Pacific coming through. And let's see, the other one heading off in this way was, I think, maybe there. This is actually taken from a metal plate that they have at the Moss Mansion, a giant metal plate that I think was used for printing plans. They don't have a lot of the prints still at the Moss Mansion, but they allowed me to take a photograph of the plate, and then we went in and drew in some highlights and some labels so that you could actually read them. Some of the other interesting features of Mossmain, the social center. You'll note that there's no indication here on the plans for bars or taverns or dance halls. This was 1910, so it was Prohibition. And the progressives were very interested in people, being good and moral, as well as being housed in nice places. So he didn't plan for any bars, and he planned for social clubs that Moss expected people would be allowed to join regardless of their class background. So he had a sort of classless ideal.
In general, up is east toward Billings, is that correct?
I believe that's correct, yes. East, up is east towards Billings. He had this notion of social centers that would be centers for the community and also morally uplifting places. He tried to concentrate a lot of the industrial activity down in one area, away from the residential activity. And if you look really close, you can see how the plots get a little bit bigger as you get farther away from the center of the city. And presumably these would be more garden-intensive plots the further you got away. And so really designed for people to be able to grow enough food to support the entire community. The garden city notion of 100 years ago, I don't think has much connection to garden city movements today, and Missoula calling itself the garden city. As far as I can tell, that name for Missoula came from the fact that it used to have a lot of gardens, and people talked about it being a garden center, and eventually they called it a garden city, but it wasn't specifically related to Ebenezer Howard's idea or Moss's following of that idea. But it was clearly some similar aims in that, yeah, you'll have lots of gardens and you'll have people being able to grow things. How did he expect to do that in Laurel, where it doesn't rain very much? Not entirely clear to me. He had been involved in irrigation. He had been building canals and whatnot. I think he expected that the canals could help support that. But if he expected it to be as big as Chicago, I don't know. Maybe rain would follow the plow. I think. Let me also talk about the publishing house here. I forget whether I have a slide later about it. The publishing house was really central to Moss's dream for what Mossmain would become. And it symbolized the other really interesting aspect of his philosophy, which was that Mossmain should be complementary to the rural areas around it. So the publishing house was going to be for a magazine called The Scientific Farmer that was helped farmers use science to increase their yields. And so the Scientific Farmer had been being published in Nebraska. Moss encouraged the publisher, Richard Haste, to move to this new location. And they set up in Billings in 1911 or so while they waited for Mossmain to appear. But it was a real functioning, going concern. Richard Haste brought his secretary and his daughter as a staff writer. His daughter Gwendolyn was in her early 20s at the time. The other thing that I haven't labeled here is this was going to be an institution. He called it the institution. What he hoped it would be would be a sort of a agricultural college. He toured some of these institutions in Europe that helped people learn how to be truck farmers, basically. Helped them understand markets for vegetables and whatnot so that they could support the local area. So Mossmain was going to be really integrated with the region. There was going to be, for example, an applesauce factory for all of these orchards around there. Closer up on the center of town, I guess I should have showed this while I was taking you on the tour of the central area.
Were the railroad yards already there?
Go ahead. Were the railroad yards already there?
Were they already down here to the west? Is
Uh,
that what the transfer yard is?
Right, I believe so. I believe that was, if they weren't already there, Northern Pacific was already planning to build them. He was definitely building his city around the plan for the railroad yards. Yeah. And of course, that's where they are today, with the shotgun willies being about here and the yards being down below. And back in the back, we're sort of talking about.
There's no commercial area or shopping area. Actually laid out are very big.
Right. There may have. I think he may have intended some commercial areas around here, and either he didn't label them, he didn't find them architecturally interesting, or I wasn't able to read those labels. So it could be that with better labeling we would see it, but it also could be that he really didn't appreciate the value of commerce. He also clearly wanted this to be different, a different city. He said, I've got this quote, "We of America have not always made a great success of our city building because there was too much financial speculation and not enough attention to citizens' social lives and leisure." So he had this plan by which you would invest in Mossmain, in the company that owned Mossmain, but it would be very difficult to actually buy land, develop land. Everything would be centrally controlled, and people would have a long-term lease on their home and garden or farm, a long-term lease with the controlling entity. of Mossmain. And so that may have been one of the reasons that he had trouble attracting investors, is that they were going to have a lot of control. They wouldn't actually have real estate involved. And furthermore, he thought that city planning had really focused too much on profit for investors and not enough on value for residents, which I suppose is an admirable goal, but it isn't really very good for attracting investors. So yeah, good. Thanks for bringing that up. There's not a lot of commercial activity, and that may be my fault, or that may have been a fault of the vision.
What was the acreage that he was encompassing?
It's really difficult to figure out how this acreage compares, especially because there are also plans for other cities, one called Gardenvale and one called Yellowstone City, I think. It seems that he hoped that Greater Mossmain would extend at least all the way down to the Yellowstone River, which is a good mile or two from the interstate at that point, and perhaps extend all the way out towards Billings as well. I can't really tell where Gardenvale is supposed to be, but when I put it on a map, it looks like it might be at least halfway from Laurel to Billings. And of course, Billings back then was not creeping towards Laurel as it has in the last 30 to 50 years.
To sell investors on this, what was he telling them they were getting for this size-wise? What were they investing in?
The prospectus was really good on the language and the vision of what he wanted Mossmain to be, and it was a little bit weak on the specifics of what you were actually going to get. So I can't really answer that question. Maybe if we had him here, he would be able to say, but I wasn't able to figure it out. Yeah.
Time-wise, did Laurel exist at this time?
Laurel did exist at this time. It was very small. And clearly, if you were going to have all these people working in the yards and living nearby, something would need to be built for them. He thought it should be built east of the yards. People in Laurel thought it should be built west of the yards. And we're about to find out who's going to win that battle. It's sort of obvious since you know what happens now.
I know you've got school up there, so would that be the only place for, other than the college that you're talking about, education for that whole community? Consider different.
Not necessarily. Again, what I did was to search really hard in the tiny print on this metal plate to identify certain important structures that I used as examples. I believe there were other schools probably sprinkled through the residential neighborhoods, and I just didn't bother to label them. So yeah, good question. But yeah, just keep in mind that that we're looking at his plan, and yet we're also looking at my examples of interesting things on his plan. Okay, so one final view of Mossmain, and this one shows a little bit more of the gardeny, the greenery that he hoped would fill in here. And of course, you got lots of lakes too, which again, his vision of water doesn't seem consistent with what I know of Laurel these days, but I don't know. What do we see of Mossmain today? Well, you can hop on the internet and find a postmark, Mossmain, 1918. He was able to get a post office designation for Mossmain. He built one building there that could be the post office. Cora Fleming, the secretary of the publishing house, had to live there. She didn't like living way out in the middle of nowhere while everyone else was living in Billings waiting for her city to grow up. But that was a condition of her employment. So there is evidence from the post office. Gwendolyn Haste, the publisher's daughter, would travel around and interview farm women and then come home and write poems about them. Later, she moved to New York and published some of these poems. She's one of the more famous Montana poets, or poets associated with Montana. Her papers are held at the New York Public Library, which is where I got this picture. The magazine has written about her, and one of her poems, I believe, is even featured in the new textbook on Montana history. Her descriptions of the real poverty and difficulty of living on these dryland farms back in the teens, the loneliness that especially the women faced in that situation.
Looks like they got something right to put camels in.
And so this is the scientific farmer, as you say, camels indicating how you were going to grow things in what people had thought was a desert and what Moss was hoping would not be a desert. But August 1919, they were claiming to be publishing in Mossmain, Montana. And again, they were actually publishing in Billings, but using this to sell Mossmain. And this, by the way, is taken from, I believe, that article on Gwendolyn Haste in the magazine. So, why isn't there more of Mossmain? The common story, the one that the Moss Mansion tells, is that, well, he had trouble finding investors, and then World War I came along, and there was no building, and so Mossmain just sort of faded. But when I looked into it, I realized that something else important happened in 1917, and that was the beginning of the drought. The homesteading bust that followed the homesteading boom of the first 17 years of the century. And so during that drought, you had things like terrible variation in yields of grain. And I've illustrated these statistics with some photos off the internet of describing, showing various areas of eastern Montana. So you've got farmland prices dropping by 50%. The number of farms disappearing totally off the map. 11,000 is about 20% of the total number of farms in Montana vanished during this time period. People had hoped that as they cultivated land, it would start raining more, that the land would pull the moisture out of the sky. Rain would follow the plow. And for the first 17 years of the century, boy, they were wetter than usual. And maybe this was really going to be true. And then for the next 10 years, they found out it wasn't. And so land that had been marginal was now not productive at all. And so the effect on the state's population was gigantic. And Jeff Malcolmson from the Historical Society here put together this chart of Montana population, and he put this together a year or two ago because he had some issue with the numbers. The line in blue is what we have commonly believed was the state population according to state estimates, and you see it just falling off a cliff after about 1917, 1918, until we get to the census number of 1920. Jeff believes that it wasn't quite so drastic. According to his estimates, it didn't rise quite so quickly, and it maybe only leveled off, and maybe it wasn't as low as the census number suggested. But whichever line you believe, clearly Montana was growing fast, and this is just in the teens. I believe the line extends in a similar rate in the aughts, was growing fast, and then it wasn't growing. And so if you were expecting the growth to take off in that line forever, and it didn't, then that was going to change not only the value of farmland, but also the value of the associated urban land. So Joseph Kinsey Howard, the wonderful historian, wrote that the story of the 20s, Montana's disastrous decade, he said it could be told by the derelict privy, the boarded-up schoolhouse, the dust-drifted, weed-grown road, and the rotting, rusted fence. And we saw some of those, some images to go along with that, just previous to this one. I'd like to suggest that there was also a story of the 20s related to urban Montana that maybe wasn't quite as visually arresting, but was still quite interesting. Because P.B. Moss expected, and let me see if we get a, yeah, I don't want to show that one yet. Let's look at the desolation for a while. Because P.B. Moss had similar expectations. In his prospectus, where he wouldn't give you any acreage data, he wrote, when this territory shall have been developed in the same per capita ratio per square mile as in Ohio or Indiana, it will have a total population of 1.6 million. Now he's talking within 100 miles of Mossmain. That 1.6 million, it's not all going to be in Greater Billings. But still, within that 100 miles, he expected the rural population alone to be 500,000. He expected lots and lots of small farms. And so when he wasn't getting lots and lots of small farms, indeed when some of the small farms that had been there ended up disappearing, his vision for Mossmain starts making a lot less sense as well. And so P.B. Moss, along with the railroads and and perhaps some of the homesteaders, expected that Montana would grow the way Illinois did. Mossmain could become another Chicago. And so here you see the growth of Illinois during one of its fastest growing periods from 1850 to 1860. And you have not only a lot of population growth in the Chicago area, but you have population growth throughout the state as people move in and establish farms and establish small towns to support those farms, and some of those towns get bigger and eventually they attract industry, et cetera, et cetera. So the visual here of the entire state getting more populous. I've also thrown in some specific numbers as you see the total population of Illinois basically exploding from 12,000 to 1.7 million over 50 years. Why wouldn't the population of Montana do the same thing? Well, the reason was that there were some natural barriers to that Montana didn't have the moisture and soils of Illinois. But it took people a while to figure that out. It took people, lots of people, a while to figure that out. There's a strain of thought thinking about this era of Montana history that I like to describe as those poor Honyockers. Those poor people who came out to eastern Montana thinking that they could start a farm and be successful. They were somehow deceived by the railroads. Bad Land by Jonathan Rabin is a wonderful book that describes those evil railroads selling people on this notion of rain follows the plow. These people who were too ignorant to understand the basic science that wouldn't happen. And I want to suggest that maybe it's not quite that simple. Maybe it's not that those people were stupid and ignorant and fooled by the railroads, because P.B. Moss was as well. P.B. Moss, this rich banker, this man who had helped build Billings into a great institution, he thought the same thing. He was just as dumb as those dumb Honyockers. And so I think in a sense, it's a more heartbreaking view of Montana history when you realize the scope of the devastation of people's dreams for the future. But at the same time, it's a little more helpful, hopeful view of Montana history that there weren't these class distinctions or class wars. There was this sense that everybody had that there were some ideals that would carry us into the future. And it turns out that almost everybody was wrong about those ideals. But, you know, we did survive. The ones who stuck around Montana were able to build a culture and a set of institutions that have really held on. Okay.
Yeah, I think one thing that really brought the homesteaders out here was wherever they came from, they might have been from Norway, they might have been from New York, was either free or cheap land. And they had grown up on a farm where there was 5 boys, and they could only afford 2. So they came for that, and, less than half survived, but that's one of the main reasons they came was opportunity.
Right, right. They came for the opportunity and the free land. And because it had worked so well in Illinois, homesteading, Illinois and Iowa and everywhere, every new western frontier, people were thinking, would homestead still work here? And they did. And would homestead still work, and you get to Montana, would homestead still work? And the railroads were saying, yeah, yeah, yeah. And my point is that everyone said, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then it turned out that the weather said, no, no, no.
Some did survive.
And right, some did survive, certainly. Yeah. Just not as many as Moss expected.
If his concept had come to fruition, how large would the average farm have been? In other words, was it reasonable, perhaps, or foolish? Optimistic?
Great question. I don't have numbers to respond with.
In general, would it be a quarter section, or?
Yeah. I mean, I think it would be the size of a farm in Illinois. He expected it to have the same population ratio as Illinois or Ohio, and the land wouldn't support that. Over here.
Did Moss have any investors invest money?
No, he did not have any investors invest money. The whole thing petered out, I guess, during World War I. By 1922, he had decided to run for Congress. Unfortunately, he ran against a candidate who was supported by the mining Anaconda companies that, of course, also owned all the newspapers, so he lost very badly. But he was on to new dreams, and after about 1920, even P.B. Moss didn't really say anything about Mossmain, and so. Was Moss a friend of Charlie Bear? I don't know. I imagine they knew each other, but I don't know how close they were.
Well, there's the sheep connection. And,
Right.
in my own family, there's a story that my grandmother came from Övertorneå, Sweden, and wound up in the Black Hills area for a short period of time. And then she and a friend went to Billings to work for the Moss family, and that the Mosses knew the Bears. So, sure hearsay in the family.
It's interesting, I mean, talking about the Mosses in Billings, I was reading elsewhere an account of women from the south side as well as the north side, south side of Billings having always been sort of the poorer side of the tracks. They would all gather in the kitchen of the Moss mansion to work on care packages for soldiers during World War I. Moss apparently had great social connections throughout Billings, throughout the classes of Billings. So it sounds like your ancestor played a role in a very interesting household.
Wish we'd asked questions.
Yeah.
Forget to do that.
Did Moss own the land where Mossmain was going to be? Had he purchased all that property?
He certainly controlled it. Whether he had actually purchased it or taken some sort of option, yes, he had some controlling interest in it. And so what he needed money for was to lay down the infrastructure and whatnot. So he couldn't do much with it without investors, but I believe he did own it. And I haven't tracked the ownership history. I don't know much more than that.
And you mentioned earlier something about his vision was a central controlling authority for the town. Do you know any details about what that might have looked like?
I don't know details about the real estate structure. All I know is the flowery language that he put in the prospectus, where he talked about how how important it was to create these cities and sort of have a firm hold on the plans. And I mean, it sounds a lot like land use planning debates today. How much do we allow for the market to let things go, and how much do we have a vision of what we want it to look like, and we need to control that vision because we think it's better. There has to be tension between those two. Moss was definitely far on the one side, and that may have contributed to why he wasn't able to bring that vision to reality. I wish I knew more about the specifics of how it was laid out. I don't. I just find it an interesting philosophical debate. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
I have an entirely different take on Mossmain.
All right.
I was born and raised in Laurel. My father was a railroader. He came to Laurel in 1913. And he and his cousin were there for a number of years. His cousin ended up buying 2 different ranches after that, about during the end of World War I. And then in that period of time from about 1920 through the Depression times, 1940 almost, that Mossmain was the place where the hobos gathered from the railroad. And the hobos were setting up and had a camp that was like a small city. It occupied part of the hill on the edge of what I think was the design that you were showing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Can everyone hear this, by the way? He's, yeah, great. Continue.
The hobos, of course, one of the things they always did and was that they marked houses where they could get food. And my mother was, this is after she got here in 1918. And so during that period of time after she got married, she would be very generous in handing out any extra food during that Depression time. And the hobos made sure that they visited not too often, but often enough to get something. And then as I was getting to be mobile, and I had a bicycle, and by the time I was 12, my dad had told me, never go down to that Mossmain. You don't know what's going to happen down there. And of course, being a 12-year-old with a bicycle with a friend, we had to go down and check it out. Oh, my perception of Mossmain is quite different.
It turns out it was about opposite what P.B. Moss had hoped for. Wonderful. Yeah, I believe Mossmain continued as sort of hobo central. The first time I heard of it was when Jennifer McKee was working at the Billings Gazette and thinking of exploring the hobo jungle herself for a story. I don't think she ever did it, but even in the 90s, there were hobos in Mossmain. Again, about as opposite his plans as you can imagine.
Trains were important.
Right. Trains were important to the hobo lifestyle. Let me return to those questions I threw up at the beginning in case that prompts any more discussion. Moss had the idea that the economy of Mossmain could be the same as the economy of Chicago. Was he right? Was he wrong? Was that part of the problem? Was that a missed opportunity?
They could have set up a stock market.
what about his quest to merge nature and urban life? Was that a foolish thing? Should he have let the market take care of it? Is there even a way to take care of it?
Well, we do kind of have parks in towns and cities all over the country. We promote parks.
Right.
So it wasn't too crazy.
Right. I mean, even today, we're trying to build a little bit of city, a little bit of country. His desire to hold on to that layout and specify where the publishing house would be and where everything else would be. Was he too controlling and that was part of the failure, or was that a missed opportunity and that would have been a really cool thing?
The biggest failure was too controlling, too limiting.
Well, I find it fascinating that he had the vision to try to bring in, I hesitate to say industry, but a business to
Right.
potentially support in addition to the road.
Right. He had a comprehensive
Right?
economic development
I
idea.
wonder if the concept wasn't right, just the geography was all wrong.
Right.
Why did Laurel end up becoming the railroad town instead of Mossmain? There was industry there, but.
Yeah.
Okay, there's no answer to that.
Right. Yeah. Great question. Yep. I get into bad habit sometimes of thinking I need to give answers to questions, and sometimes they're just great questions.
Was Laurel the junction between the NB and the CB&Q? Is
Right.
that the reason?
Still is. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then the final question, do we have similar ideas, rain follows the plow, that are leading us astray today?
Old setup down there by Three Forks, Wheat, Montana. Now, huge subdivisions, no water. But I'm sure we can do it.
Subdivisions that didn't go over so long.
Well,
I think the thing with Three Forks is they think that everybody wants to move there because Bozeman's right down the road. But they're gonna have to fill up the whole valley before they get to Three Forks.
I was struck by a comparison between this and the financial crisis of 2008, where there's one line of thought that blames those people who got subprime mortgages and they brought the economy down, and yet all of Wall Street was surprised by the crash, that there were lots of smart people who believed that real estate would continue to grow. And so, maybe the blame, if any blame needs to be given, can be more widely distributed today as in 100 years ago. And I mean, that's just one possibility. There's clearly lots of others.
One other thing to take the rain follows the plow concept, Wheat, Montana, which is down there by Three Forks, is an example of a very successful, well-managed farming enterprise. And it's just the technology of doing it right, or the better varieties that are available. So in a left-handed sense, you can say they've showed that it does.
That rain can follow the plow if you do it
Or
correctly.
we can suck it up out of the ground. Add value to that product. Yeah.
is there any relationship to all those utopian people? I mean, the idea that there's some entity, you can't really buy this, so capitalists aren't going to be interested, right? So you can't buy and sell, there's no real estate deal. Why would anybody want to? Except for the greater good of a wonderful place to live. Sounds pretty utopian.
Yeah. I don't know a lot about the history of utopias, but as I understand it, it's been a continual or even continuous substrand of American history, that there's always people who think we could build this really cool thing, and they get really excited about it, and it doesn't necessarily make any sense. But I think it's interesting to look at utopias because they show us some of the values of at least some people at the time. And so that's what fascinated me about this story. Okay.
Well, we do have planned cities in this country. And there's one in Washington DC called Greenbelt. And it was built specifically for all the people who came to Washington DC during World War II to work in whatever was going on. And so it's, to have a planned city isn't all that far-fetched in my mind. But I think, and, if you see Laurel and that whole valley west of Billings, it's pretty lush.
Mm-hmm.
And it could have, supported quite a few people.
Yeah, and I'm glad.
Out to the North Country.
I'm glad you brought up the idea of the planned city. I don't want to imply that Mossmain was unique because it was planned. I mean, actually, you look at a lot of ghost towns and you can see the layout was going to be a lot bigger. There's always been planning. What I found interesting about this is the level of sophistication of the planning because he hired this guy from Chicago. And also the details of what was in the plan suggest the kind of utopia that P.B. Moss thought Montana needed. Whether he was right or not, it's just sort of interesting what they were thinking about 100 years ago. Kirby.
I don't really expect you to have an answer to this, but I've always wondered why are Calgary and Edmonton there? I mean, it seems like, why do you have such big cities and, the weather's worse, it's colder. Why are there big cities there and not in Montana? We should point on two different railroads.
The days in the summer are really long, they can grow really good wheat up there. They got better weather than we do,
Well, Kirby, I'm glad somebody had an answer for you because I sure didn't. Yeah.
I'm from Conrad, and W.G. Conrad laid out that whole area up there between Blair and Conrad, and that was part of his ranch. But it was developed around the idea of irrigation, which, there were irrigation congresses and stuff going on back in the 1890s and forward. And then federal irrigation acts passed, so the whole idea succeeded up there because it was revolved around Swift Dam and the bringing of water down from the Rocky Mountains. So that, that community is kind of the contra.
Mm-hmm.
I did have a question. You said P.B. Moss had various businesses. Some were successful and some weren't. Do you know which ones were successful other than his sheep businesses and some of the others? I know he invested in Billings Automatic Telephone Company.
Right. I think the telephone company was successful. I mean, I think. Oh, it was not successful. Oh.
He was an investor in Great Western Sugar, that still exists.
Right. And the Northern is certainly outlasted him. Yeah, I had him associated with electricity, heat, telephone, irrigation, and newspapers. I don't know details about how successful any of them were. Clearly, the reason I know that some of them were not successful is that they actually foreclosed on the Moss Mansion. And somehow his family arranged to just live there anyways, because what was the bank going to do with it? But for decades, the Moss Mansion was sort of in this weird limbo. And it was only after his death that it was restored and we saw his original vision and dream, and so he got sort of rehabilitated with the building being rehabilitated. But I took from that the fact that he was not always all that successful in life. I wish I knew more and I wasn't able to find it. Yeah.
Did he have children, and are any of them still in Montana?
He had 3 or 4 children. You can get their bios at the Moss Mansion website. I don't believe any of them are still alive. I don't believe many of them had children themselves. And I'm sorry, I don't know more.
What year did he die?
He died in the early 40s, maybe?
I do know that he had a daughter named Melville, and she was a weaver, and she was a member of the Billings Weavers Guild, as was my mother. And before she died, she used to hold the Christmas meeting, and so the weavers would all go to her mansion to have a nice evening meeting and meal, or at least refreshments. And ironically, my husband and I own Melville Moss's loom, which is a very nice Macomber loom, that when they had the estate sale, one of the Kucheras from Billings was the executor. And, you know, my dad used to say, oh, those weavers, they're just like vultures. One of them dies and everybody's after their looms. Indeed, my dad bought my mother Melville Moss's Macomber loom for only $700, which is, you know, much less than its value. And then when they redid the mansion, or, you know, wanted to open it, of course, they would like it to be donated back, but then my husband had started weaving. I inherited the loom, he weaves, and so we opted not to do that, but they replaced it with a comparable. But Melville, you know, is a sheep raising area, isn't it?
Yeah.
In Montana,
Right.
so I don't know if she was named after that.
For questions about the mosses, I should have just turned to the moss expert in the audience. It's great to, Montana's like a small town where somebody will know the answer somewhere. This,
You try never to get away with anything or plan to get away with anything in Montana.
right, somebody will know.
Degrees of separation.
Somebody will know. Since we have exhausted my knowledge on this topic, let me suggest that we close here. If you have other questions or comments or stories, feel free to share them. But thanks so much for coming tonight and for sharing and helping me explore this fascinating topic. So, thank you. Kirby,
There are books in the bookstore.